The heavy glass doors of the Jade Pavilion swung open with a soft, expensive hiss, letting in a gust of damp, city air that clashed immediately with the scent of sandalwood and seared wagyu. Li Wei stepped onto the polished marble floor, his worn sneakers squeaking slightly against the pristine surface. He felt the weight of the plastic bag in his hand, the handles stretched thin by the weight of 3 stacked Tupperware containers, and instinctively pulled his faded windbreaker tighter around his chest. He didn't belong in a place where the chandeliers looked like falling rain made of crystal, and he knew it. He wasn't here for the ambiance, he was here because of a promise. Behind the mahogany host stand, Julian Vane was finishing a conversation with a couple draped in cashmere. The moment his eyes drifted toward the entrance, his professional smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He adjusted the cuff of his $2,000 suit jacket, his movements sharp and performative, before marching toward Li Wei. He didn't walk so much as he patrolled, his nostrils flaring as if he had just encountered a pile of burning trash in the middle of his dining room. He stopped exactly 3 feet away, maintaining a distance that suggested Li Wei carried a contagious disease. Julian didn't ask if he could help. He simply stared at Li Wei's scuffed shoes for a long, agonizing beat before looking up with a sneer that pulled at the corner of his mouth. He asked what on earth Li Wei thought he was doing there, his voice a polished blade of condescension that carried across the quiet, high-ceilinged room. Li Wei cleared his throat, his voice low and steady despite the heat rising in his neck. He explained that he was looking for the owner, that he had something important to discuss regarding the property. Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew the attention of a nearby table. He looked over his shoulder at the wealthy patrons, sharing a silent joke with them at Li Wei's expense. He told Li Wei that the owner didn't have time for delivery boys, who couldn't even afford a decent coat, let alone someone who looked like they'd just crawled out of a basement. He reached out, his manicured finger prodding the plastic bag Li Wei held. He asked if this was some kind of pathetic attempt at a bribe or if Li Wei was trying to sell ethnic leftovers to a 5-star establishment. Sarah, a young waitress with tired eyes and a kind face, hurried over with a pitcher of water, sensing the escalating tension. She hesitated, then softly asked Li Wei if he'd like to sit for a moment while she checked the back. But before the words could fully leave her lips, Julian snapped his fingers in her face, telling her to get back to the service station and stop encouraging vagrants. He turned back to Li Wei, his face inches away now, radiating a cold, synthetic heat. In a sudden, aggressive motion, Julian lunged forward and snatched the plastic bag from Li Wei's hand. The suddenness of the move caused Li Wei to stumble back, his hand brushing against a tall, hand-painted ceramic vase on a pedestal. The vase rocked precariously, a metaphor for the fragile piece in the room. Julian didn't wait. He marched over to a heavy, silver-lined trash bin near the weight station and dropped the bag inside. The sound of the plastic containers hitting the bottom was muffled, but to Li Wei, it sounded like a door slamming on his heart. Julian wiped his hands on a linen napkin as if he'd been defiled by the touch. He told Li Wei to get out before he had security drag him to the curb and toss him into the gutter where he belonged. He pointed toward the door, his eyes wide with a manic sort of arrogance. Li Wei didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his gaze dropping to the trash can where his mother's carefully prepared recipes, the only things he had left of her, now sat among discarded napkins and table scraps. When he finally looked up, the timidness was gone. His eyes were like flint. He told Julian, very quietly, that he should have checked the name on the lease before he threw away a legacy. Julian just laughed again, oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath his expensive shoes had just begun to give way. The smell of ginger and star anise used to cling to the walls of the tiny basement apartment in New York like a second skin. To a young Li Wei, it was the scent of safety, but to the world outside, it was a marker of his otherness. 30 years ago, the world didn't look like marble floors and crystal chandeliers. It looked like the steam rising from a rusted pot and the flickering light of a single bulb where his mother, Mama Chen, stood for 18 hours a day. He could still hear the rhythmic thrum of her knife against the wooden cutting board, a sound that beat like a second heart. She would stand there until her ankles swelled to twice their size, packing containers for the neighborhood laborers just to scrape together enough coins for his business school textbooks. Every dollar he spent on his education felt heavy, weighted with the salt of her sweat. He remembered sitting at a small, cramped desk in the corner of that humid kitchen, trying to study macroeconomics while she hummed old Cantonese folk songs. She would push a bowl of her signature noodles toward him, her hands red and calloused, and tell him that one day, people would pay for the dignity of their culture, not just the calories. She didn't want him to just be a businessman, she wanted him to be a man who carried his heritage with a straight back. But Mama Chen never got to see the skyscrapers he eventually built. She passed away in that same basement, her body simply giving out from a lifetime of being the engine that drove his dreams. As Li Wei stood in the center of the upscale restaurant, the memory of her funeral, small, quiet, and paid for with the last of his savings, clashed violently with the present. He wasn't dressed in a three-piece suit today because he had spent the morning in the cold, dim light of an old storage unit. He had been kneeling on the dusty concrete, sifted through boxes of her old aprons and handwritten recipe cards, searching for the specific blend of spices she used for her special braised pork. He had finally found it, tucked inside a tattered envelope. He had cooked it himself that morning, a quiet ritual of remembrance, only to have it treated like filth by a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. While Li Wei's past was built on the quiet dignity of sacrifice, Julian Vane's history was forged in a different kind of fire. Years earlier, in a sleek corporate office across town, a younger Julian had been escorted out of a high-end hotel by security. He had been fired for cultural insensitivity, after mockingly imitating the accent of a foreign dignitary's wife. To Julian, that wasn't a failure of character, it was a personal grievance against a world that was becoming too sensitive. He had clawed his way into the Jade Pavilion by polishing his exterior and sharpening his tongue, learning to hide his malice behind a veneer of aesthetic perfection. He viewed his management position not as a job, but as a border patrol, ensuring that the wrong kind of people never crossed into his sanctuary of status. The tension in the air of the restaurant now felt like a physical weight, a bridge connecting 30 years of struggle to a moment of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Li Wei looked at his empty hands, the phantom weight of his mother's food still lingering in his palms. He saw Julian standing there, smirking, a man who thought he had won because he held a position of temporary authority. Julian didn't realize that he wasn't just insulting a customer in a stained jacket. He was spitting on 30 years of a widow's labor. He was mocking the very foundation of the building he stood in. The hidden truth was vibrating through the floorboards, a silent countdown beginning as the past and present finally collided. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from uncomfortable to toxic as Julian realized he had an audience. He wasn't just going to remove Li Wei, he was going to make an example of him. He pulled out his sleek corporate smartphone and tapped the screen with a flourish, his eyes never leaving Li Wei's face. Within seconds, two burly security guards in dark suits appeared at the entrance, their presence casting long, intimidating shadows over the dining room. Julian leaned in, his voice dripping with a fake, theatrical concern that was louder than necessary. He told the guards that this individual was harassing the staff, making threats, and clearly suffering from some sort of mental break that made him a danger to the high-caliber guests. From a nearby corner booth, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was pulled so tight by plastic surgery it seemed frozen in a permanent state of disapproval, chimed in. She adjusted her silk scarf and loudly declared that she hadn't paid $400 for lunch to be accosted by the unwashed masses. She pointed a manicured finger at Li Wei, telling Julian that his presence was literally lowering the property value of the street and that she expected a complimentary bottle of crystal for having to endure such a traumatic sight. Julian bowed deeply to her, assuring her that the infestation was being dealt with immediately. The humiliation intensified as Julian ordered the guards to search Li Wei right there in the middle of the aisle. He claimed he wanted to make sure no silverware or expensive wine had accidentally fallen into the man's pockets. Li Wei stood perfectly still, his chin tucked slightly, enduring the rough pat-down while patrons whispered and pointed. He felt the cold air from the vents above, but it was nothing compared to the icy stares of the people he had once hoped to serve. He was completely isolated. Sarah, the kind waitress, tried to step forward to protest, but Julian glared at her with such predatory intensity that she froze, her knuckles white as she gripped her serving tray. However, in the shadow of the bar, Marcus, the assistant manager, was doing something Julian didn't notice. He stood with his back to the room, pretending to check the inventory on a tablet, but the device was angled perfectly to capture the entire scene on video. He watched through the screen as Julian leaned over the trash can, fished out a photo of Li Wei's face that he had surreptitiously printed from the security feed earlier, and walked to the front door. With a smirk of pure malice, Julian used a piece of heavy-duty tape to slap the photo onto the "Do Not Admit" list on the glass door, right at eye level for everyone on the street to see. Julian walked back to Li Wei, his chest puffed out like a peacock. He told him that he was officially banned for life from every establishment under this management group. He leaned in close, so close that Li Wei could smell the expensive, minty mouthwash covering the rot of his character. Julian whispered that people like Li Wei were the reason the country was losing its standards and that he should stick to the back alleys where the trash belongs. With a final, dismissive wave, he signaled the guards to shove Li Wei toward the exit. As Li Wei was forced through the heavy glass doors, he didn't stumble. He caught his balance on the sidewalk, the cold rain beginning to mist over his windbreaker. He reached into his pocket and realized he had dropped his silver fountain pen, a gift he had received when he closed his first billion-dollar deal, on the restaurant floor during the scuffle. He looked back through the glass one last time, watching Julian laugh with Mrs. Gable. Li Wei didn't look angry. He looked like a man who was simply checking the time before a long-awaited appointment. He turned and walked toward a blackout SUV idling at the curb, the heavy door closing with a solid, armored thud that signaled the end of his silence. Inside the dimly lit cabin of the black SUV, the silence was heavy, broken only by the muffled rhythm of the rain against the reinforced glass. Li Wei sat in the back seat, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow of a tablet screen. He wasn't the broken man who had just been shoved onto the sidewalk. His posture had sharpened, his shoulders squared, and the look in his eyes was no longer one of humble patience but of cold, calculating precision. For years, he had operated in the shadows, building the Chen Wei Group into a titan that moved markets without ever needing to put a face to the name. He had come to the Jade Pavilion today to see if the soul of his mother's dream was still intact. He had his answer. The screen in front of him flickered with a live data feed. He scrolled through a series of red-flagged financial reports he had acquired through a quiet acquisition of the restaurant's primary debt holder just 24 hours prior. The numbers didn't lie. Julian Vane wasn't just a bigot, he was a parasite. The reports showed a consistent bleeding of the emergency payroll funds and a series of inflated maintenance invoices that led directly to a shell company Julian had set up in his cousin's name. Julian thought he was a king, but he was actually a thief burning down the castle to keep himself warm. A soft buzz came from the center console. Li Wei picked up an encrypted satellite phone. On the other end, his lead counsel spoke with a clipped, professional tone, informing him that the final signatures had been processed. The Jade Pavilion was no longer owned by a faceless hospitality group. It belonged to Li Wei. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the silver pen he'd left on the floor, the one that had signed the deals for skyscrapers and tech hubs. He didn't want it back yet. He wanted Julian to find it. He wanted the man to hold a piece of the power he was about to collide with. Li Wei's mindset shifted entirely. The victim had left the building. The architect had arrived. He knew that simply walking back in and firing Julian would be too merciful. It wouldn't fix the culture of the place, and it wouldn't teach the Mrs. Gables of the world that their money didn't buy them the right to dehumanize others. He needed to play the long game. He needed Julian to feel the highest peak of his own hubris before the fall. That night, in a secluded corner of a city park, the headlights of the SUV cut through the mist to reveal Marcus standing by a bench. The assistant manager looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder, but he held a USB drive tightly in his hand. As Li Wei rolled down the window, Marcus didn't see a vagrant. He saw the man whose name was on the secret memos circulating through the upper echelons of the city's real estate. Marcus handed over the drive, whispering that it contained not just the footage of the afternoon's assault, but 3 years of Julian's falsified ledgers and a recording of him mocking the staff's dental plans. Li Wei took the drive, his fingers steady. He told Marcus that he had done the right thing and that a person of integrity would always have a place in his organization. When Marcus asked what the plan was, Li Wei didn't give an angry speech. He simply told him to help Julian plan the most extravagant, expensive gala the restaurant had ever seen. He told Marcus to let Julian believe he was about to be promoted by the new, mysterious owner. Li Wei wanted the lights to be at their brightest and the guest list to be at its most elite when the truth finally walked through the front door. The trap was set, not with a roar, but with a silent, devastating click. The following 48 hours were a masterclass in invisible warfare. While the world saw nothing but a quiet, middle-aged man disappearing into the city fog, Li Wei was a whirlwind of calculated precision behind the closed oak doors of a penthouse boardroom. He sat at the head of a glass table, his faded windbreaker replaced by the crisp white shirt of a man who owned the skyline. Around him, a team of forensic accountants and top-tier litigators worked with the quiet intensity of surgeons. They peeled back the layers of Julian Vane's life like rotted wallpaper. Every stolen cent from the restaurant's payroll, every kickback from unscrupulous vendors, and every cruel memo Julian had ever typed was being catalogued into a digital guillotine. Li Wei watched the data accumulate with a stoic patience, his mind already 3 steps ahead, ensuring that when the strike came, there would be no room for a counterattack. Back at the Jade Pavilion, the atmosphere was a grotesque celebration of ego. Julian was in a state of high-octane euphoria, convinced that his moment of ultimate ascension had arrived. He moved through the dining room with the swagger of a conquistador, snapping his fingers at the busboys and demanding the silver be polished until it could blind a beggar. He had convinced himself that the mysterious new owner of the Chen Wei Group had noticed his stern management style during the recent incident and was coming to the gala specifically to promote him to regional director. In his mind, he wasn't just a manager anymore, he was a partner in waiting. He spent the afternoon in his office, feet up on the desk, browsing luxury car websites and laughing as he selected an Italian sports car in a shade of red that screamed of stolen wealth. He viewed the upcoming gala as his coronation, a final purging of anything he deemed low class from his kingdom. Unbeknownst to Julian, the very foundations of his victory were being hollowed out. Li Wei moved through the city like a ghost, making a stop at a modest culinary school on the outskirts of town. He waited by the entrance until Sarah, the kind waitress who had tried to help him, finished her afternoon classes. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped under the weight of her textbooks and the stress of her double shifts. Li Wei didn't approach her as a billionaire, he approached her as a friend. He handed her a small, plain envelope and told her that her kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. He spoke of a new venture, a place where the recipes would have soul and the staff would be treated with the dignity they earned. He didn't tell her he was the owner yet, but he left her with a glimmer of hope that felt like a lifeline in a stormy sea. As the sun began to set on the day before the gala, the final pieces of the trap clicked into place. Li Wei made a series of encrypted calls to the city's most influential food critics and local news investigators, promising them a story that would redefine the meaning of investigative dining. He spent his final hour of preparation back at his mother's old kitchen table, which he had moved into his penthouse. He ran his fingers over the wood, feeling the grooves where she had chopped vegetables for 30 years. The contrast was staggering. The quiet dignity of the past versus the loud, hollow arrogance of Julian's present. Li Wei stood up, his face set in stone, and looked at the bespoke tuxedo hanging near the window. The silent grind was over. The celebration of the trash Julian thought he had removed was about to begin, and the guest of honor was someone Julian would never see coming until it was far too late. The evening of the grand rebranding gala arrived with a theatrical flourish of gold leaf and velvet. The Jade Pavilion had been transformed into a sanctuary of excess, designed specifically to cater to the vanity of those who believed the world was divided into predators and prey. Outside, a line of sleek, black town cars and exotic sports cars idled along the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the neon pulse of the city. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Julian Vane stood at the center of the foyer, looking like a man who had finally ascended his throne. His tuxedo was a masterpiece of Italian tailoring, and his smile was as bright and hollow as a polished skull. He moved among the guests with a practiced, oily charm, his eyes constantly scanning the room to ensure that only the right people were occupying his space. Mrs. Gable was among the first to arrive, draped in a coat of silver fox fur that seemed to vibrate with her own sense of self-importance. She clutched a flute of vintage Krug, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the waitstaff. She leaned in toward Julian, her voice a conspiratorial rasp that carried over the soft jazz quartet. She told him how much she appreciated the higher standards he had implemented since that unfortunate incident with the vagrant, remarking that the air in the restaurant finally felt breathable again. Julian let out a short, triumphant bark of a laugh, assuring her that under his continued leadership, the riff-raff would never so much as glance at the windows of the pavilion again. He checked his diamond-encrusted watch every 30 seconds, his heart hammering against his ribs in anticipation of the mysterious new owner's arrival. The atmosphere was a powder keg of irony. The staff, led by a stoic Marcus, moved through the crowd with a precision that bordered on military. Marcus had spent the last hour ensuring the large high-definition screens mounted on the walls, meant to show a promotional video of the restaurant's history, were primed and ready. He caught Sarah's eye across the room. She looked nervous but resolute, her tray held steady as she served the very people who had watched her be humiliated just days before. Julian was too intoxicated by his own perceived power to notice the way his employees looked at him, not with fear, but with the quiet, terrifying anticipation of spectators watching a car crash in slow motion. Then, the heavy oak doors at the entrance were pulled open by the valet, and a hush rippled through the ballroom like a cold front. A man stepped into the light, but he was unrecognizable from the delivery boy of 48 hours ago. He wore a tuxedo that made Julian's look like a costume, a deep, midnight blue wool that seemed to absorb the light around it. He wore a silver masquerade mask, intricately carved and mysterious, which obscured the upper half of his face. His presence was magnetic, a gravitational pull that drew every eye in the room toward him. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. This had to be him. This was the man who held the keys to the kingdom. Julian practically sprinted across the marble floor, his hand extended, his back bowed in a gesture of extreme sycophancy. He began a frantic, desperate pitch, his voice cracking with the effort to sound sophisticated. He told the masked man that the restaurant was operating at peak efficiency, that he had personally purged the elements that were dragging the brand down, and that he was ready to take the pavilion to the next level of global luxury. He spoke of exclusion as if it were a virtue, boasting about how he had handled the disgusting man who had tried to bring home-cooked trash into this sacred space. The masked man didn't speak. He simply tilted his head, watching Julian through the eyeholes of the mask with a stillness that was deeply unsettling. He allowed Julian to dig the hole deeper and deeper, listening as the manager bragged about his ruthless standards and his commitment to perfection. The guests began to gather in a semicircle, sensing that the climax of the evening was approaching. Julian, sensing he had the floor, signaled for the music to stop. He walked toward the small stage at the front of the room, puffing his chest out. He announced to the elite of the city that he was honored to introduce the new visionary owner of the Chen Wei Group, the man who would surely recognize Julian's invaluable contribution to the brand. He stood back, clapping loudly, his face flushed with a delusional, greedy joy, waiting for the man to take the stage and crown him the king of the pavilion. The silence that stretched across the ballroom was heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket that dampened the sound of 100 elite hearts beating in anticipation. Julian Vane stood on the edge of the stage, his hands clasped tightly, beads of sweat beginning to break through his expensive foundation. He beamed at the masked man, his ego so inflated he could practically feel himself floating. The mysterious owner stepped into the center of the spotlight, the silver of his mask gleaming like a blade. With a deliberate, slow motion that seemed to pull the air out of the room, he reached up and unfastened the silk ties. The mask came away, revealing the face of Li Wei. The transformation was absolute. The man who had stood in a grease-stained windbreaker 48 hours ago was gone, replaced by a titan whose gaze held the weight of an empire. Julian's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. His jaw physically dropped, his mouth hanging open in a silent, grotesque O of disbelief. The champagne glass he was holding slipped from his numb fingers, shattering against the stage with a sharp, crystalline explosion that made several guests jump. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked as though he had been turned to salt. Li Wei didn't say a word at first. He simply looked at Julian, then turned his gaze toward the large high-definition screens on the walls. With a sharp nod to Marcus, the promotional video began. But it wasn't a montage of fine dining. It was the raw, grainy security footage from 2 days prior. The guests watched in a horrified, buzzing silence as the screen showed Julian sneering, mocking Li Wei's heritage, and violently dumping the home-cooked meal into the trash. The audio was crystal clear, capturing Julian's voice as he called Li Wei trash, and told him to rot in the back alleys. Mrs. Gable, standing in the front row, let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She quickly tried to slide behind a tall floral arrangement, her face flushing a deep, mottled purple as she realized her own vocal support of the abuse was now a matter of public record. The room, once filled with the scent of lilies, now felt like a courtroom. Li Wei stepped toward the microphone, his voice no longer the soft, hesitant tone of a supplicant. It was a low, resonant rumble that commanded the very molecules of the air. He told the room that he had come here to honor his mother's memory, to see if the dream she had died for was being guarded with honor. Instead, he had found a man who treated human dignity like a disposable napkin. Li Wei reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, tossing them onto the floor at Julian's feet. He informed the shaking manager that he hadn't just bought the restaurant, he had spent the last 48 hours buying every debt Julian owed, every line of credit he had abused, and the very firm that handled his personal accounts. Li Wei leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed through the sound system. He told Julian that the Italian sports car he had ordered that morning would never be delivered, because the emergency funds Julian had stolen from the staff payroll were currently being tracked by a forensic audit team. He revealed that the silver pen he had left on the floor was worth more than Julian's entire career, and that he had used a different pen today to sign a warrant for Julian's arrest for grand embezzlement. Julian tried to speak, his voice coming out as a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out toward Li Wei's polished shoes, begging for a misunderstanding to be cleared up. He claimed he was just stressed, that he was trying to protect the image of the company. Li Wei looked down at him with a cold, detached pity. He told Julian that a man who mocks a mother's cooking while stealing from her son's company doesn't need a second chance, he needs a lawyer. As the heavy doors at the back of the room opened to reveal 2 uniformed police officers, Li Wei delivered the final blow. He told Julian that the only trash being removed tonight was the man currently kneeling on the floor. The handcuffs clicked into place with a cold, mechanical finality that seemed to echo louder than the jazz quartet ever could. Julian Vane, stripped of his dignity and his designer composure, was led through the center of the ballroom he had once considered his kingdom. The very guests who had laughed at his jokes only minutes ago now pulled their skirts and coats away as he passed, treating him with the same visceral disgust he had once reserved for Li Wei. Mrs. Gable kept her head down, staring intently at the bubbles in her glass, terrified that a single look from the new owner might incinerate her social standing. The police officers didn't linger, they moved him quickly toward the service entrance, the same back alley Julian had told Li Wei he belonged in. In the wake of the chaos, the restaurant didn't fall into a somber silence. Instead, there was a sense of profound relief, like a fever finally breaking. Li Wei stood on the stage for a moment, looking out at the faces of his employees. He called Marcus and Sarah to the front. There was no arrogance in his voice now, only a weary, quiet warmth. He announced that the Jade Pavilion would close its doors for 1 week. When it reopened, it would bear a new name, Mama Chen's Pavilion. He told the staff that their back pay, stolen by Julian, would be reimbursed twofold by the end of the night. He looked at Sarah, whose eyes were shimmering with tears of joy, and promised her that her tuition was no longer a burden she had to carry alone. He was building a legacy, he said, and a legacy was only as strong as the hands that built it. 5 years passed like the turning of a well-loved page. The city's culinary landscape had shifted, and Mama Chen's pavilion was now a landmark, famous not for its exclusivity, but for its soul. On a Tuesday afternoon, Li Wei stepped out of his car near a busy highway rest stop a few hundred miles away. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a grease-stained windbreaker, just a simple, well-made sweater. He walked into the cramped, fluorescent-lit bathroom of the service station. There, hunched over a mop bucket with a gray, frayed uniform, was a man whose face was etched with the deep lines of a hard, bitter life. Julian Vane didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the dirty tile, his movements sluggish and defeated. He spent his days cleaning the very floors he once thought he was too good to walk upon. Li Wei didn't say anything to him. He didn't need to. The cycle was complete. Li Wei returned to his car and drove back toward the city, stopping at a quiet garden he had funded in his mother's name. In the center of the greenery stood a bronze statue of a woman holding a simple cooking pot, her expression one of eternal, nurturing peace. He sat on a bench nearby, the smell of fresh soil and blooming jasmine filling the air. He thought about the day he had walked into the restaurant with those plastic containers, and he realized that justice wasn't about the fire that destroyed the villain. It was about the light that remained for everyone else. He had learned that you can buy a building, you can buy a bank, and you can buy a reputation, but you can never buy the quiet sleep of a man who knows he has been kind. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the garden, Li Wei took a deep breath of the evening air. The world had a way of balancing the scales, sometimes slowly, sometimes with the sudden weight of a falling mask. He knew now that true class was never found in the sparkle of a chandelier or the cut of a suit. It was found in the way you treated the person who could do absolutely nothing for you. He looked up at the statue one last time, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. Karma was a long journey, but it always, inevitably, found its way home.